Hi everybody, happy Earth Day. My name is Scout Bloom and this is History Through Games. We're going to be doing a segment today called Games and Books, where we're going to be pairing a tabletop game and an academic book on the same subject to sort of see how the two interplay and what you can learn from both of them. Now in this episode, I hope I'll be doing a lot more of these, but in this episode, in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, we are going to be taking an environmental theme. That's good for me. I'm an environmental historian. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at the game Wilderness by Thomas and Daniel Fryxelius. You will recognize that name. Of course, another member of the Fryxelius family designed Terraforming Mars, which I'm sure most of y'all have probably heard about. This is a little bit of a lesser known game, but an interesting one. The book we're going to be pairing it with is a classic in American environmental history. It's by Roderick Nash and is called Wilderness and the American Mind. And it's just an amazing intellectual history. So we'll be talking about the interplay of the game and the book and what we can learn from each. So let's spend a couple of minutes talking about Wilderness and the American Mind by Roderick Nash. This is just one of the classics of American environmental history. It's an amazing book. What Nash is doing in this book is he's looking at how the idea of wilderness has changed over time. And it's really a neat book because it introduces the concept of cultural construction in a really accessible, readable way. What historians mean when they say cultural construction is that certain ideas, certain concepts are made by us or made by society, that they're not natural or set in concrete from day zero to the end of time. And wilderness is one of these ideas that has changed quite a bit over time. Nash starts with basically the beginnings of America and ends with the mid to late 20th century. What he does is he talks about several main strains of thought about what wilderness is. That there were, particularly early on, thinking about wilderness as evil, as a place of testing. Those kind of ideas even go back to the Bible. Thinking about wilderness as, a difficult and a trying place. We certainly see this with the early Puritans and Pilgrims when they arrived here. Their views about what the wilderness that they were seeing when they got to America were very much sort of this place of danger and hard times and trying times. So there's that kind of conception. And then what he also discusses is beginning later in the 1800s is a different kind of reaction to wilderness. And that really arrives with the beginnings of industrialization in the United States and with the cities beginning to build up and become bigger. It's going to become much more prominent in the early 20th century. But these ideas of wilderness as an aesthetically beautiful place, these ideas of wilderness as somewhere to go to restore yourself, to sort of an antidote to the city, almost. So, a place of beauty and a place of restoration, a place of spirituality. Again, these kind of ideas are going to start gaining strength as America becomes more and more industrialized. He also talks a lot about sort of the origins of some of these ideas in the eastern part of the United States, and then being almost foisted upon the western part as the idea of national parks begins to take hold in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Certainly as well, one of the things that Nash talks about in sort of the ideas of the park movement and how ideas of wilderness were sort of playing off of that is how American exceptionalism played into it. In the 1800s, Europe, of course, had all these massive, beautiful, historic cities that had a lot of importance. They had a lot of these important landmarks. And one way, though, that America could compete with Europe was with scenery, and in fact even do better. So part of the idea of wilderness being exceptional and very American and wanting to enshrine that came from this idea of wanting to protect American wilderness and scenery, and seeing something that was worthwhile, that might not have had a lot of monetary value necessarily, but was worthwhile in its aesthetics. So that's a lot about what Wilderness in the American Mind is all about. Basically looking at the changes in these ideas over a very long period of time about how people thought about wilderness, and the two main strains being wilderness is dangerous, a place of testing, very difficult and trying, versus this idea of wilderness as beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, spiritual, a place for renewal. So let's look at the game and see what it says.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the game. The game is called Wilderness. It is designed by Daniel and Thomas Fryxelius, and Daniel did the artwork for the game as well. The one that we're using is actually the second edition. It was initially introduced at Essen in 2011 and came out more formally in 2012. So again, it's a bit of an older game. The theme of the game is that you have been basically attacked, and you've been left in this wilderness far away from civilization, and you are trying to get back. And you know that there's a civilization out east, and you have to sort of make your way through the wilderness. So the wilderness is made up of, or the game is made up of this big long board of wilderness, which are triangular boards with hexagons on them for the spaces to move through. And there are different kinds of terrain that you can move through. All the while you are kind of battling with thirst and hunger and your energy level, your exhaustion. This is a really hard game to win, by the way. I don't think I've ever won it when I played. As you go along, you're trying to find areas that have water to take care of your thirst. But most of the time those are in really dangerous areas and sort of bad things happen to you. Anyway, so this is a game where you're sort of moving your piece across territory to try to get to safety, which is in the very bottom right hand side of the board. One of the things that's really interesting about the game is that nature itself has a turn, which to me as an environmental historian is fascinating, because it's giving nature a voice and it's giving nature a sense of agency. You rarely see that in games at all, this sort of recognition that nature plays a part in something. So there is a spinner over on the right hand side of the board that you spin, and this is part of each round, where you are trying to accommodate and figure out what nature is doing. There are also cards that you have, event cards, where you kind of choose between different effects, one that benefits you in the game and one that hurts your opponents. And then every time that you enter a swamp hex, again, this is a lot of the times you can find sort of water around there, but when you enter the swamp hex, you have to draw a sickness card, and so lots of horrible things happen to you when you get into a swamp. One of the interesting things about this game is its view of wilderness, particularly through the sickness cards. Pretty much nothing good happens to you in this game. All of the cards that you draw are always bad. There are just really horrendous things that happen in the game to you. And this association of swamp with illness as well. So what this game tends to do is to present an incredibly negative view of wilderness. This is sort of the much earlier version of wilderness that we see from that we see from Nash, rather than the more modern version of wilderness, which is interesting. But again, nothing good really happens to you in this wilderness, and it is very easy to die. There's another concept that's really apparent in the game, which is also interesting, and it's interesting as well as an artifact in game design. Now what we're starting to see is that game designers are really starting to take into account issues of diversity, and to put different types of characters in the game. Well, we're not seeing that definitely in this game in 2012. All of the player boards are men. They all appear to be white men. You might be generous and say that some of them might not be, but they are all male. So this experience, this game experience, is meant to be of men. It is meant to be a male experience out in the wilderness. This is also really fascinating to me, that this idea of men being tested out in the wilderness. Can they use their wits and survive and get back to civilization? Again, civilization is the main goal here. So what's interesting is this idea and tying masculinity to wilderness. That too is a very old idea. Certainly you can talk about Teddy Roosevelt. When you talk about this around the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, Roosevelt did a lot of writing on masculinity and tying masculinity to being out in nature and being out in the wilderness, something that he thought was very important as a way to reframe masculinity, and as a way to pull men away from what he thought was the weakening, feminizing influence of the city. Of course, all of that was happening. Teddy Roosevelt's redefining masculinity. All of that was happening in the wake of women making really substantial gains in the public sphere. They were starting to speak out more. They were starting to be more active in reform movements, particularly the environmental movement, interestingly, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So a lot of these things, these ideas that we see in this game Wilderness, are really interestingly reflected in history. So those concepts in the game are just really neat, and it's kind of an interesting game to play for those purposes. So basically what we see here is a game where the premise is you've been beaten up and you have to make your way through this horrible wilderness where you're probably going to die before you get back to civilization, and where nature is trying at every step of the way to try to hurt you and stop you and back you down. So again, this is a really interesting game from a perspective of looking at wilderness and looking at how game designers have thought about wilderness over time. But again, a very sort of one-sided view too.
Now, you don't ever get a full picture of something from just looking at one book. So there are a couple of others that I would pair with Wilderness and the American Mind, and also to sort of bring some diversity in. Like game design, environmental history was pretty white male for a while. It has become much more diverse recently, and topics have started to certainly incorporate in the last 20 to 30 years a lot more about women, a lot more about people of color. So there's been that addition in, which is also the direction that games are going to, which is really encouraging to see. So the books that I think that I would really pair with this one, with Wilderness and the American Mind, there are a couple. This is Carolyn Finney's Black Faces, White Spaces, which is just a really fascinating look of sort of thinking about African Americans in natural places, and the effects of racism on their interaction with the environment. And so this one's a really good one to bring in some of those attitudes about race and ethnicity. In addition, this one is, I don't have the cover on it. This one is called Vanishing America. It's by Miles Powell. And this one is a really powerful look at sort of the underbelly of the conservation movement. In environmentalism, we tend to think of the early conservationists like Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt as really being heroes, as being some of those early sort of pioneers in the conservation movement. What Vanishing America does is it kind of takes a look at the ties that the conservation movement had with nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, racism, all of these kind of darker sort of movements within America, which of course were particularly prominent at the time. And so pairing these two sort of will give you a much sort of fuller picture of the conservation movement and sort of wilderness protection and ideas about wilderness overall. Hi, so I hope that you have enjoyed a game and a book this time. We've looked at Roderick Nash's Wilderness and the American Mind, a classic in the history world, and also looked at a game on the same topic, wilderness. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and mainly, you know, what I'm hoping to do is to get game designers to think more about using academic works when they think about their themes. That can really enrich games to a great extent, to think about sort of a much wider perspective. But also I want historians to begin to think about using games as sources, because tabletop games, same way we often use movies or music as sources, tabletop games can be a really valuable source too. So again, thanks for watching. Happy Earth Day, everybody. Happy 50th to Earth Day, and we'll see you next time.